Welcome, Wildcats. My name is Rose Strumlau, and I'm faculty in the departments of History and Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Davidson College. We're live streaming from campus. If you're one of my students, you might recognize my office in the prior building. And we miss our students very much. Even though we're scattered in homes around the world, we are still a learning community, and I'm so glad that you could join us for the first of 6 lectures in our social distancing lecture series sponsored by the Department of History. Each Wednesday from now until May 6th, a member of our faculty will moderate a conversation with a scholar who will share their research about human experiences of disease and recovery in the past in order to put our experiences of this pandemic in context. You can see the rest of the lineup, and it's quite impressive, at the calendar at the bottom of the college's homepage, www.davidson.edu. Our speaker will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. At any point during the talk or the Q&A, you can text your question or your comment to us, and you can do that by texting SDLS 797, so Social Distancing Lecture Series, SDLS 797 to 22333. That's SDLS 797 to 22333. And you will receive a confirmation text and then just send us your question or your comment. If you feel comfortable doing so, please let us know your name, where you are now, and if you're a student, faculty or staff member, alum, community member, or we know we have some of Paul's friends joining us too. We would love to know who is participating. If at any time the tech fails us and we disconnect from Paul, we'll pick up wherever we left off as soon as he rejoins us. Maybe just take that as a sign to go refill your glass and come back in a minute or two. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the staff members who have hustled to make this series possible in a week and a half's planning. That's Ebony, Daniel, Adele, our student assistant who's joining us tonight, Winnie, and everyone at College Communications. I am so happy to be virtually welcoming our guest tonight. Dr. Paul Kelton is the inaugural holder of the Robert David Lyon Gardner Chair in American History at Stony Brook University. He received his PhD from the University of Oklahoma and taught at KU before heading to Stony Brook. A leading scholar of Indigenous North American and colonial American history, Paul has made important revisions to our understanding of the biological processes involved in the European takeover of the Americas. His 2 monographs, Epidemics and Enslavement, Biological Catastrophe in the Native Southeast, 1492 to 1715, which was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2007, and Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs, and Indigenous Nations Fight Against Smallpox, 1518 to 1824, which was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2015, have transformed the field. Both place local struggles with epidemics within the large-scale context of the social disruption, structural violence, and political upheaval of settler colonialism. If we judge the value of books by the number of sticky tags in them, I can promise you that my copies of both of Paul's books are loaded with them. Students who have taken my native history classes here at Davidson have read his work and are familiar with his arguments. At a time when many people question whether the actions of individuals matter, Paul's Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs in particular, makes the case for the significance of human agency and strategic action for the common good. It does save lives. It has in the past, and it can now. Paul is kindly taking time away from his sabbatical to talk to us about his current book project, which is a social history of the cholera pandemic of the 1830s, centering the experiences of Irish immigrants, enslaved Africans, and the Choctaws. Paul, you have the screen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That was a wonderful introduction, very generous. Thank you, Rose, for setting this up, and Adele for coordinating this. And thanks for Davidson College, and thanks for all people out there that are logged in. Yeah, I wanted to talk about my project here. And at the end, I think you'll definitely see some parallels to today's situation. Definitely, I don't want to say that, history, the cholera epidemic of the 1830s is repeating itself now, but I definitely think there are rhymes. As historians like to say, that history doesn't necessarily repeat, but there are rhymes in history. And I think you'll see that. And I also want to say that, as historians, whenever we hear anyone say, no matter what, politician of one stripe or the other, say something like, we've never seen this before, historians' ears often perk up because, yeah, we've seen pandemics before. They have happened in the past. And so I hope that we learn some lessons from those. And I really appreciate this series that Rose has put together. I think it's a great idea. So anyway, cholera. Very different disease than COVID-19. Cholera is caused by a bacteria that, and one gets it by drinking sewage contaminated water. So very different disease that spreads very differently. It is very violent though. The mortality from cholera can be much higher than COVID-19. What happens is when one ingests the bacteria, it invades the gut and replicates itself in the intestines and releases a toxin that paralyzes the lower intestine, causing the deterioration and a flaky appearance in the stool. So this is a real, obviously, horrid disease. The diarrhea comes on very quickly, in which someone could lose gallons of water within a matter of hours, suffer severe dehydration. The body will shut down and the skin will take on this blue tint to it. So it's a very clear disease when someone has it, that, by observation of the stool and by the coloring of the skin, and mortality very quickly. So it's a very nasty disease. And it burst on the world stage, so to speak, in the 19th century. It didn't come to the Americas until 1832. Now, this epidemic in the 1830s, it spread from Asia, and I'll talk in more detail, from Asia to Europe, to Africa, and to the Americas. So it was a global pandemic. And there are several global pandemics of cholera in the 19th century. It's perhaps not the first global pandemic. I mean, smallpox spread far and wide in the 18th century. Yellow fever spread far and wide in the 18th and 19th centuries. But what's, I think, unique about cholera is that it affected a large swath of territory, not just port cities, but inland cities as well. And people wrote about it voluminously. Doctors were there observing, their reports were published in newspapers, and these newspapers circulated around the globe. And so it was a pandemic in which there was a global consciousness about it. So the epidemic, from all accounts, began in South Asia in the 1810s, particularly in Bangladesh, spread into India, and kind of burst out of India in the 1820s into the Middle East and in southern Russia. It hits Moscow in 1830. And in the summer and fall of 1830, reports are that 8,000 people in Moscow came down with the disease, and of those 8,000, 4,000 died. So about a 50% mortality rate. There would have been more, but many of the Muscovites, they fled once it came. It spread into Central and Eastern and Central Europe because at the time there was a rebellion in Poland. Republican-minded Poles were rebelling against Tsarist rule. The Tsar mobilized his troops, sent in the army to crack down on the Poles, and along with the army, cholera spread. And throughout the spring and summer of 1831, there are massive loss of life in Eastern and Central European. And it spread from there into Germany and along the Baltic states and into Italy. And eventually, of course, it made its way from the Baltic ports to England by October of 1831. So Americans know what's happening. They're reading about it in the newspaper. And from a very early time, they speculate that it's going to cross the Atlantic. there's a flare-up in England and Ireland and France in 1832. And eventually, cholera does make it to the Americas. It lands aboard ships in Quebec and Montreal in June of 1832. And from Canada, it spreads through the St. Lawrence Valley and into the Great Lakes. It spreads down south through the Hudson Valley and it ultimately reaches New York City late June, early July. And of course, it becomes a major epidemic in New York City. New York City by mid-July are having deaths over 300 a day in a population of about 200, let's see, New York was about 130,000 at the time, I believe. By the time the epidemic ran its course in New York City, by mid-September, early October of 1832, about 4,000 people lost their lives. Now that's a large chunk of the city of New York, and it would have been more, of course, but a lot of New Yorkers fled as well. Now we often think of cholera as this urban epidemic, and New York City has been the focus of much of the attention. But as Rose outlined to you before, that my work is looking at the epidemic more nationwide, and indeed spread south into the Chesapeake area, into the Upper South, down the Ohio, and eventually makes its way to New Orleans. New Orleans was hardest hit of any city in the United States. By late October, thousands of New Orleans are dying. Now we don't really have good statistics because municipal authority broke down in New Orleans, but some people estimated up to 6,000 people in New Orleans died in October and early November of cholera. And the reports are just truly ghastly. You have bodies that were just simply being thrown in the Mississippi River, people dying in their homes and not being discovered for days. Just a horrible, wretched experience. Now, cholera is a seasonal type disease in that the bacteria thrives in warm water. And so you'll see it flare up in the spring and summer and early fall, and then kind of die out in temperate climates in the winter. However, in the case of North America, cholera finds a home in southern Louisiana and then Cuba, and Cuba suffers a major epidemic in early 1833. The disease comes back into the United States, sweeps up through the Mississippi Valley, back east this time, and strikes a lot of places that had escaped before. Places, smaller cities like Lexington, Kentucky, had 400 to 500 people die in June of 1833. And it would flare back up again in 1834 and 1835, and eventually it would fizzle out by 1836. This was a huge epidemic. Some estimates are, we don't have really reliable data to make estimates. Historians have bandied about numbers such as 50,000 to 150,000. And I hope in my research that I'll be able to make some kind of better guess at this. And I'm not quite there in tabulating this all up. And a lot of the deaths went unrecorded. And so we're not ultimately gonna know. But if it was 150,000 people that died from Americans died, that's 1.2% of the population. That's not case fatality rate, that's total of the American population. That would surpass, of course, the numbers of the 1918 influenza epidemic. However, that 150,000 mark, that may be too high, we're not sure. But we are certainly talking about an epidemic that took as many, percentage-wise, American lives as the influenza epidemic. Now, cholera would stay around in the 19th century. It would come back in waves in the 1840s into the 1850s, and then again at the tail end of the Civil War. And it was in the 1850s that it was realized what was causing it, that it was sewage contaminated water. And so that led to improvisations of, or improvements, I should say, of city infrastructure in which sewage lines were redirected away from water supplies, fresh water was brought in, and ultimately, of course, you get the modernization of water and sewage treatments where cholera doesn't become a problem. And often when cholera is written about in history books, it's in that narrative of one of progress and improvement, particularly in the cities. But cholera is still here today, and there are cholera flare-ups, and there was one in Haiti, of course, with the earthquakes, and of course in Rwanda with the genocides going on there and the refugee crisis resulting, in which people are forced into wretched conditions in which water supplies become contaminated. Cholera is embedded in the shellfish populations on the Gulf Coast. And so periodically you'll have someone come down with a case of cholera. But it does, and you'll have people coming into the United States actually with cholera. But it doesn't become a problem because of the water treatment plants. So this is, kind of a lesson for how important it is that we maintain our water infrastructure and we protect it from being contaminated. Cholera is an example of that, but of course to this day, there are outbreaks in our water supply of things like cryptosporidium that are washed into the water supply from agribusiness and other sources. So let me talk a little bit about kind of the social history here about this. I kind of sketch out the epidemic. First of all, Americans saw it coming. They were reading about this in the newspapers. And by the spring of 1832, there's consensus, I would say, among American doctors, American newspaper editors, some government officials that cholera is coming. And they developed their own ideas about what this would be. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and what makes it very different from today, is that this is occurring before the germ theory. And it's before the understanding that many of the diseases that we suffer from are caused by living organisms that invade our body, that reproduce and replicate, and they trigger symptoms in our body to produce the means in which they get to the next body so that they can reproduce themselves. And so that germ theory had not been invented. There were people that speculated about invisible creatures or animals so small that you couldn't see them, but largely this was dismissed as voodoo or superstition. And so a lot of people, what people believed caused disease are on one hand, poisons that people had in their bodies that emitted, that people that came into contact with those poisons became sick. And that was believed to be a contagious disease. That's how they define contagion, that you come in contact with these poisons that pass from person to person. And it was by observation, people in the 1830s understood that some diseases were contagious, smallpox, for example. But other diseases didn't seem to be transmitted in such a way. Yellow fever, for example. Yellow fever was a disease in which some neighborhoods seemed to suffer more than others. And so it was this kind of mystery. How could these diseases erupt? And so what you have the development of is this anti-contagion theory, that diseases didn't spread through contagion, but spread through miasma, which was believed to be bad air that arose from decaying vegetative matter, that sometimes was energized by atmospheric influences. And there was this debate about cholera. Was it contagious or was it non-contagious? And it was truly baffling. And to be kind of fair to people in the past, if you observed cholera, on one hand, it did seem to follow. It spread from one place to the next. It followed armies. It spread along waterways. It spread, from when boats landed in ports from infected areas. But it seemed to miss people in between. And also some doctors worked extensively with cholera patients and never got sick. And so it seemed that this wasn't contagious. So how could it spread? Very few people suspected contaminated water or dismissed the idea that poisoned water was kind of a superstition or folktale that poor people told. They should have listened to them. So cholera, there was a consensus in America that, at least among the learned class of people, the doctors, particularly newspaper people, and particularly business interests, that this was not a contagious disease. that had spread through atmospheric influences that were going to come to America. And once they came to America, that they would prey, the disease would prey on certain groups of people that, in the language of the day, were predisposed to the disease. And the predisposing conditions were seen as filth, intemperance, people that drank a lot of alcohol, people that ate bad food, people that lived in unventilated houses. These were the vulnerable. And conversely, then, if you were temperate and you ate well and you lived in high and airy places, you were invulnerable. So there is this language of vulnerability that I see developing. Another aspect of the American thought was that if you got this disease, that you could survive it with timely medical aid. In other words, if you caught it early enough and you saw a doctor and the doctor administered medical aid, that you would survive. And the miracle drug, so to speak, at the time was this drug called calomel. Calomel is mercury. And mercury was prescribed in doses that could kill a horse at the time. And mercury was used widely as a laxative. It was used to kind of regulate the bowels. And so to this bowel disease, to get kind of in regulation so that you're passing more appropriate matter instead of cholera stool, you took calomel. So you have doctors who are treating patients that are fearful. They're very afraid that they're going to get this disease. So as soon as they start to feel a rumbling in their stomach, or if they get a small case of diarrhea, they go to a doctor, or a doctor comes to them, they get this calomel, and the doctor says, great success, we've cured you. And so you have doctors with saying, out of 100 patients, I've cured 99. Well, probably 99 of them didn't have cholera to begin with. So when cholera arrived in cities, what you saw and towns is, first of all, is there's just general denial that goes on, that this is not the real cholera. This is just regular seasonal diarrhea. And there's a dismissal of the early accounts as exaggerated, that this was nothing more than diarrhea. And of course, there's this preaching of this language of invulnerability, that if you're temperate, if you're well-fed, you don't have anything to worry about. And of course, business interests really supported this, because it meant then that you didn't have to do things like quarantine. You didn't, people stayed in the cities. People from the country came into the cities to buy goods and to sell their products. And so commerce kept flowing. However, a lot of people didn't buy this, particularly when it became clear that cases were mounting. Those that fled did flee. And what you see is our cities becoming ghost towns. New York City, by mid-July, becomes, according to many counts, a ghost town. Now, in many places, in cities and small towns, municipal authorities did swing into action. They didn't just, there weren't, this is the 1830s. You may not think that there was kind of, boards of health and other, but there were. And so what you do, you see, if boards of health weren't in existence, they were created. And they took measures such as cleansing the city, hauling away manure, making sure that it wasn't littering the streets, because it was believed to be the kind of source of the miasma that was kind of energizing the atmosphere and creating this deadly situation. Often the manure was hauled away and put in the rivers, which of course the rivers fed some of the water supplies. Fresh markets were closed down because it was seen as fresh fruits and vegetables were seen as deadly, particularly as they decayed. Buildings were cleansed with chlorides of lime, and hospitals were built. Now, hospitals in that day and age were not places necessarily for recuperation and health. They were places of incarceration. And they were places to put people that were sick and dying. And it was widely seen, particularly among immigrants, that hospitals were jails that people were sent to die. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Another thing that municipal authorities did, of course, is they started to count. They started to count the number of cases and the number of deaths. And business interests, of course, were watching these very closely and looking very closely to when the number of cases and deaths started to decline. So they could declare their cities now open for business. And what you see is when numbers, New York City, which we know the best, when numbers started to fall into the dozens instead of the hundreds, then you get a lot of people saying, okay, coast is clear, come back. Well, people did start to come back, and you see the numbers spike again. And this happens again and again in cities and towns. Well, what about this kind of language of vulnerability? Who really died and who did survive? So deaths did, in some degree, conform to the predictions made, but not for the reasons that people espoused. People thought, people made bad choices. They drank too much. They ate acidic fruit like pineapple and watermelon and other fruits that were seen as kind of dirty or filthy. They ate these and then they suffered the consequences. So poor people tended to die in larger percentages than the more affluent. Of course, they died in those numbers because they had no choice. They had to stay in the cities. They had to stay in their jobs. They had to drink whatever water they could find, the local from the local wells that were contaminated. They didn't know it, but they didn't have any choice. My work is focused on three particular groups. I'm looking at Irish immigrants, and they suffer tremendously from the cholera epidemic. And often they find themselves having to do, because they had no income, they couldn't stay in the cities, so they find themselves working on railroads and canals. And canals were filthy places to work, and you see the rates of cholera infection skyrocketing along the canals that were already constructed, like the Erie Canal, or canals that were being constructed, like the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal that was supposed to link, never did, but it's supposed to link the Chesapeake to the Ohio River, or the Raritan and Delaware Canal that was cutting across New Jersey. You see Irish immigrants dying in large numbers, but what you see is canal owners hiding this and covering it up, and proclaiming that these deaths are exaggerated, nothing to see here, keep coming to work for us, to assure their stockholders that work was going along schedule. And in the embankments of many canals are the bodies of Irish immigrants that perish from this. The Irish were particularly seen as purveyors of the disease, and when anyone, the Irish who came down with this, often were the first to be hauled to the hospitals. In Utica, New York, for example, the Irish got so fed up of seeing their loved ones taken to these filthy places to die that a riot ensued. And an Irishman who in one newspaper accounts referred to as Barney Keaton, and another is Barney Keating. He supposedly led an Irish mob attacking a Utica hospital, and he declared, he was asked why he did this, and he declared it's because they killed all the Irishmen who were taken there to be cured of the cholera. And he wasn't, totally wrong, because what you're doing is confining people that may not even had cholera. They may have been sick from another disease, but they're put right next to someone that did. Another group that perhaps is kind of surprising suffered in large numbers were enslaved African Americans. Now, slaveholders, of course, were very fearful of cholera, and they, for obvious reasons, tried to protect their slaves from being infected. They had invested a lot of money in enslaving other human beings and expected to extract labor from those human beings to make a profit. But there are another group of people involved in the system of slavery in the United States. And those were people who traded or trafficked in enslaved African Americans. That is, by buying African Americans in places like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and sending them to the Deep South, to the cotton and sugar plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi, where there is a tremendous demand for slaves. The cholera epidemic, in a very ghoulish way, fed this traffic, because what happened is you see a large number of enslaved African Americans perishing in Louisiana and the lower Mississippi Valley, creating a larger demand. And the slaveholders, the slave traders, in their correspondence, they're quite candid about their willingness to risk the lives of enslaved African Americans that they trafficked to try to make a profit, to cash in. One of those slave traders was a man named Isaac Franklin. He was one of the most notorious slave traders, a very wealthy man, in fact, because of the slave trade. He's busily involved bringing enslaved African Americans either overland through Tennessee, down the Tennessee to the Mississippi, to the slave markets in Natchez, Mississippi, or by ship, coming from places like Norfolk, Virginia to New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi to Natchez. A number of his slaves in December perished because of cholera. He's trying to avoid cholera-ridden places. He's trying to manage this. The last thing he really wants, of course, is his slaves to get cholera. He would not be able to sell them and make a profit. And also, if others knew that he was trafficking in diseased slaves, they wouldn't want to buy them. So about 16 slaves end up dying. And what he does is he and his partner and his workers, they bury the slaves in the middle of the night in makeshift graves to cover up the cholera deaths. He writes to his partner, "No person in this country knows that we ever had a case of cholera. Keep dark." In other words, he's telling his partner back in Virginia, we have to do this, but let's keep it a secret. Well, historians now, we've uncovered that secret. We not only have uncovered that secret, Mother Nature, so to speak, uncovered that secret because storms came through torrential rain and they washed out the graves, and decaying bodies became discovered by Natchez municipal authorities. It created quite an uproar in Natchez, not because of the inhumanity of the slave trade or the inhumanity of slavery, but because they feared that those decaying bodies would spread cholera. And so what the Natchez City Council did was outlaw the buying and selling of trades within city limits, and they forced the slave trade out to a place called the Forks in the Road, which becomes this notorious slave trading hub until the Civil War. The last group that I want to mention here are the Choctaws. The Choctaws, of course, were numerous indigenous a tribe of indigenous peoples in Mississippi, numbering about 20,000 people in the 1830s. They're also the first group that are essentially forced west by Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. They're aware cholera is coming, and it hits them very hard as they're being forced onto steamboats down the Mississippi and up the White River to an encampment in Arkansas, where they were going to be collected and sent overland through Arkansas into Indian Territory, what is today Oklahoma. Hundreds die aboard these steamboats and in the encampments in Arkansas and on their way to Indian Territory. One of the agents that oversees this is kind of a loyal Jacksonian, and he writes back to his superior, "No man but one who was present can form any idea of the difficulties that we have encountered owing to the cholera and the influence occasioned by its dreadful effects. It is true we have been obliged to keep everything to ourselves and to browbeat the idea of the disease, although death was hourly among us and the road lined with the sick." So you have Jacksonian administrators trying to cover this up. And of course, Jackson himself covers this up because he declares in 1833 that the experiment, as he called it, of Indian removal has had a great success. Everyone in America knew that hundreds of Choctaws were dying on what they called the Trail of Tears and Death. It was in the newspapers, it was reported, it was predicted by those that opposed Indian removal. But Jackson, of course, was promoting this narrative that it was in the best interest of the Choctaws. The Choctaws, of course, suffered tremendously from the totality of Indian removal, probably losing about a quarter of their population from 1831, when Indian removal began for them, to the mid-1830s. So this language of vulnerability kind of hid mass class divisions. It was actively, there was some active covering up of those who died that were under the control of native-born whites. But of course, there were those that weren't supposed to die that died. the invulnerable. Governors died. There was a senator died. There was a newspaper editor died. And these really kind of mystified and put people into this kind of position where we have to explain this. And often what they did is they explained it, well, these people must have had pre-existing conditions, that they must have been suffering from a long-standing illness, or maybe they acted imprudently and slipped up. They didn't see a doctor in time, or they ate something they shouldn't have. But largely these people that died had grandiose eulogies and expressions of how great they were. But meanwhile, someone like Betty, who was a 13-year-old slave that was carried by an enslaved human being, carried by Isaac Franklin up through New Orleans to Natchez, who died and was buried, and who's only, as far as we know, the only evidence that we have of her life in the documentary evidence is on a ledger sheet where she died and her value. She didn't get a eulogy, whereas someone like Peter Hoffman Cruz, who was a newspaper editor in Baltimore. He writes very interestingly. He's a pretty well-known guy. He writes a series of letters from Baltimore in August and early September of 1832 while the epidemic is flaring up in Baltimore. And he first writes the letters that, there's nothing to worry here. It's only going to hit the poor. And the doctors are good. They're skillful. And he writes this one letter and he says, now look at the statistics, that out of 100 people that have died, 75 are Blacks. And of those 75, 72 were free peoples of color. And he writes this, and he writes this, he's clearly a racist pro-slavery guy, and he writes this, so much for freedom. He writes this in a letter dated September 7th. It was the last letter he would write. He went to his friend, and then his friend learned that he died of cholera. He died, and the eulogy is that he was a great enlightened man, a kind-hearted person who happened to die, and his cause of death was that he ate too many tomatoes and boiled onions. It was probably the treatment that killed him, because doctors came in and bled him because they thought it might relieve his symptoms and cure him. So not a happy story that I'm writing about. No pandemics are. This pandemic in particular, because there's really no happy ending. There wasn't a miracle cure at the end. And there was a great deal of forgetting at the end. I think I'll probably come to that in the question and answer, how people kind of forgot about it. But episodes like this are very important for us in that we learn more from kind of the ugly events in the past, the ugly legacies, I think, than the happy stories. One of my students, I will never forget, when I was a young assistant professor and I gave a lecture, I think probably gave a lecture on Indian removal, something like that. She came up to me and she asked, why don't you ever tell any happy stories? And I just said, it kind of caught me off guard, but I just, we learn more from the unhappy stories. We learn more from the acts of injustice and oppression and the consequences of racism and classism, because we deal with those today. And we need to learn how to deal with them so that we can have a more humane future. And so I think the cholera epidemic is a clear case in which you see rampant inhumanity that people try to cover up and bury. But historians' job is to go back and uncover that so that we can learn from that, so that in today's climate that we are more sensitive about this, and we call out inhumanity when we see it. So, thank you. So I'm open for questions and be happy to answer what I could.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. So if folks have questions, now would be a great time to text them. Again, text SDLS 797 to 22333. That is SDLS 797 to 333. Um, so I've already gotten a few questions from folks who are texting me personally. So I'll start with those, Paul.
Okay.
The first is from Stephen, who's a community member in Davidson, North Carolina here, and wanted to know if you could comment on the role of the press. There's so much debate, especially on social media today, about the ways in which COVID-19 has either been downplayed or exaggerated, depending on your political perspective. What is the role of the press in the 1830s in informing the public about cholera?
One of the ideas I'm working with is that, ironically, Americans were more prepared for cholera in June of 1832 than we seem to be of COVID now. There's about an 18-month period in which the press is reporting widely. What they're doing is they're receiving letters from Europe. They're receiving European newspapers, particularly the British newspapers. And they're just simply plagiarizing. They're taking, articles and inserting in their own newspaper. And the editors are commenting on this. The newspapers are also publishing the views of doctors in Europe and America. And based on what they thought was true, they were prepared in a way. It's just what they thought was true was not right, and because they didn't have the germ theory. There was a very politicized press in the 1830s, surprisingly probably more than today, in that you had real pro-Jackson presses and anti-Jackson presses. I don't think there's a kind of the pro-Jacksons fall on one side of this and the anti-Jacksons on the other. I want to investigate that a little further. It's not something I really wanted to go down to because I'm not sure, I can prove that. Jackson himself, it would be wrong as a historian, I think, to kind of expect a national response to cholera in the 1830s because of the way the government was structured and the knowledge at the time. He was rather callous. I mean, he was, pardon my language, but he was a callous son of a bitch. I mean, he just really didn't care about anyone other than his supporters and his family. And he wrote these loving, I'm not really answering the question. I got to use this opportunity to bash Jackson. While Choctaws are dying, he writes his family, saying, please be careful, avoid travel, stay at home. And he's sending, thousands of Choctaws down the river to die. So anyway, the press. So I think it's very unfortunate in today's climate that our press is so politicized about something like a virus. Now, to be sure, China has fault in this. And one of the major differences between cholera then and COVID now is that even though there's a war going on in Europe, both Russia and Poland had English and French and even American doctors there observing and sending back reports. And we didn't really have that with COVID, and that's unfortunate. And the press should have, I guess I'm critical of the press for not really being more forceful about that. We needed to know more. It's, unfortunate that there's such a combative nature today between the press and the presidency. The president is the press baits him and he takes the bait and you go back and forth. I hope that's kind of the nature of the particular president we have now and not necessarily inherent in that relationship. The press, I think, is doing a fairly good job of keeping us informed. I've always said, about CNN, I don't think they're as partisan as people believe they are. What CNN's bias has always been is on conflict and kind of drama. And I mean, from the early days. And so they've thrived on that no matter what the cause is. And what I see CNN doing is often right now is like the largest number of cholera deaths yet to date. Well, of course it is. I'm sorry, not cholera, COVID. Of course it is. I mean, every day is going to be the largest number of deaths until we hit the peak. So, I would say they need to kind of downplay that a bit, but that fine line of being very serious about this. We need to take it seriously and call out those that are making light of it. I mean, that was a good thing. I think it's good that the press keeps the heat on the administration and calls them out for when they did minimize this, when they knew they ought not to have done that. So, how do you do that? I think, there's a danger in that the press could push too far, in that they can pick fights just for the sake of picking fights. Now, we already know where this administration dropped the ball. I mean, that's clearly documented, it's clearly out there. Partisans may, the very convinced may still argue that. Come on, we know the evidence is there. People can make up their mind about that based on the evidence. Let's move forward and let's just be realistic as we can. That would be my take on that.
Thank you. So someone just texted a question that was longer and got cut off. So Adele tells me to ask that person, whoever you are, to resend your question, and we'll ask it next. But I do have a question from a Davidson student, Ashley, and she wanted to know, considering that cholera changed the way that people lived in their communities and interacted with one another, can you, as a historian living today in COVID-19 times, speculate how social distancing will impact us economically going forward? Do you think that this is the new norm for schools and companies, and will we continue to engage in these behaviors even when the threat of COVID-19 has passed? So I guess we're asking you to predict the future as a historian.
Well, I'm not very good at predicting the future. I can really predict the past very well. But let me talk a little bit about the past first. And with cholera, it was not stay at home, it was get the hell out of your home and go away. So it's kind of the opposite. But there is a similarity in that there's a privilege of being able to respond in such a way. Mm-hmm. There's a privilege in the cholera epidemic, if you had the means to put up your carriage, and sometimes you might have servants, to take you, if you lived in New York City, to go to the Catskills. Mm-hmm. If you lived in Richmond, Virginia, to go beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains, mm-hmm. a mountain resort. There are mountain resorts there, spring waters, they were advertised. You had that privilege to do so, and that would have been what would have been advised. The parallel today is, of course, stay at home, but that's still a privilege. That not everyone can stay at home. I mean, if the choice is losing a job, if business is still open, or staying at home, having a job and being able to pay your rent and buy food, or staying at home and not having a paycheck, it's very, you're going to take that job. And, staying at home, well, for some people, staying at home means, you're sharing a small apartment with five or six people. So our response today, unfortunately, is one that not everyone has the privilege to. And so there is that I think commonality that we should really, in the future, be aware of. That when we're talking about pandemic preparedness, that with a respiratory disease like this, that staying at home, what does that mean? Well, you have to have a strong social safety net that can be nimble and robust enough to allow people to do that. Now, in terms of, is this going to shape our interactions? Yeah, I mean, it will. I mean, I hope. I don't like this. I mean, I think a lot of, I would rather, be at Davidson and talking to you in person. I like to go to the archive and do my research, and I mean, that's really a minute problem to have. I'm very fortunate that's kind of a problem for me to have. I don't know. That's the short answer. What I hope happens is that you see larger degree of international cooperation, mm-hmm. An understanding that things, testing needs to be universal and quickly done so that you can isolate and track contacts. That's number one, how you stop these epidemics. You get to this point. Yeah, I mean, I hope we're not doing this repetitively. It's something we certainly should be prepared for. I don't. Yeah, I think we can take efforts to like handshaking and hugging and those kinds of things, and more wearing masks, maybe things like that. But no, I don't think we're going to start canceling conferences necessarily. Those conference organizers probably need to plan a little accordingly. I don't know about you, but I think every time I came back from the AHA, I usually had a stomach bug or a cold. If you are interacting with a lot of people, and yeah, we can, maybe that's a okay price to pay, but not something like COVID. So I didn't really answer the question, but it's a good question.
Thank you. I think that also answered Jean's question. So Jean, one of our faculty members here, asked you to comment on socioeconomic disparity, and I feel like your answer addressed that. We have another question from a Davidson alum in California named Pam, who wanted you to follow up on your comment earlier about how folks forgot about the lessons of cholera and what the memory of this pandemic was after the immediate threat had passed.
Yeah, very good question. So there's actually people that commented that, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Basically, you see that in the correspondence and the letters, because it was exhausting. People were terrified. They really were. And they wrote about it constantly. But I think the forgetting in part was because there was this illusion of success. As I mentioned, some doctors proclaimed that they could actually cure cholera. And so that there's this, the historiography tends to tell us that there's a lack of faith in doctors, but, I'm actually kind of finding the opposite, particularly in the South, in which slave masters become the kind of dominant consumer of professional medicine. There's also an illusion of success in that there was such a buildup for the epidemic. The press played this role in a way that they built this up. That this was going to be, Black Death proportion, and it turned out not to be. And folks, in part because folks left the cities, and the case fatality rate could be very deadly, but it didn't infect as many people as what you might expect. And so people didn't lose, a lot of families didn't lose people. And so then the interpretation is, well, what we did was success. And the people that died, well, they kind of, it was their own fault. It's because they're drunks or they made bad choices. And so nothing really was done. New York City did realize that they needed to have a better water supply, not because they realized that they needed clean water to drink, but they thought that they needed clean water to come down and cleanse their streets. And so it was a impetus of New York City improving its water supply. Philadelphia had a pretty good water supply and didn't suffer as much, but it was not based on a real true understanding of the disease. But what happens? 1848, 1849, cholera comes back and creates a nightmare situation. It spreads further west. It spreads to California and infects gold miners and indigenous peoples in California. So they really forgot, or didn't. I guess they didn't really understand that their supposed invulnerability was an illusion. And I think that's a lesson that's prevalent today. When we look back at this epidemic and we look at this thing called underlying conditions, to what degree are those underlying conditions something that no one really could have helped? And to what degree are those consequences of poverty and inequality? And I think what we'll find that a large degree of those are, and I hope that when we look back on this, that we ask those hard questions and we don't let kind of an illusion of success blind us. And I do think, I worry that there will be an illusion of success. I think what you'll see happen, I'm predicting the future here, is, there's estimates of 200,000 Americans dying from this. from some models. Other models say, it might be, 60 to 100,000. I suspect by election day, you'll see, 60 to 60,000. And I hope it's on the lower end. But then what's going to be proclaimed? What we proclaimed is that what we did was a great and tremendous success. And that illusion of success, the success in our social distancing, or the actions of our government had success. But what that will do is blind us not only from looking more definitely at those pre-existing conditions, but look at the blundering that happened to begin with, and look at how, with a more concerted international effort from the beginning, that the spread could have been inhibited. Experts were saying this in June, January, and February in the United States. So those voices should not be hidden by an illusion of success.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question that I'm curious about, which is, as a historian working in the time period that you worked in for your first two monographs, you're used to writing book-length projects with very little evidence, right? And that's what folks who work in the Native South, especially in the colonial and early Republic period, do by skill and training. You have a ton of material to work with on the cholera pandemic. So as you're working on this project, how have you figured out when to say when, and why did you pick these three groups of people to be your case studies? And if you were to add a fourth, who else's experiences could tell us something interesting about cholera?
Yeah, I hope I can say enough's enough and keep myself in, but there's just so much. And one, I did really want to focus on the social history more than kind of the nuts and bolts of what people thought about, the medicine aspect, but I kind of getting stuck into that. It's actually those, particularly the Choctaws experience, that got me into this project. In my Cherokee medicine book, I was going to take the Cherokees' experience with smallpox up through removal. And smallpox just definitely was not that big of an issue for the Cherokees during removal. By removal, smallpox vaccine, of course, had been perfected. Many Cherokees had become vaccinated against smallpox at the time. But in the research, I found groups of Cherokees that moved, kind of voluntarily moved before the forced removals of 1830, 1839. There's one group of Cherokees that move in 1834, and they're put on this steamboat, and they're going up the Arkansas, and they experience cholera. At one point, they threaten to throw the white doctor overboard because he's, trying to administer this toxic stuff to them. And then when they arrive in Oklahoma, the conductor, he's a military officer, he's writing what he told the Cherokees, and he told them, I paraphrase, but it's our misfortune was due to no human agent. And he says it very, he's trying to, say this was, accident, it was, not meant to happen. But he also, in that same letter, he writes to his superiors, don't use steamboats. Of course I do, because they're cheaper. And so anyway, long-winded way of getting to this question of why these groups. Well, the Choctaw, though, I learned were, suffered from this epidemic. And so while I'm doing research on the Choctaw, I discovered this episode of the Isaac Franklin burying slaves. Mm-hmm. And wow, that's a really morbid, confluence, and, that the slave human trafficking and ethnic cleansing, spreading diseases, which makes sense in terms of the way we understand epidemics, and they spread in times of upheaval, warfare, human trafficking. These are purveyors of disease. So I wanted to make that connection. The Irish immigrants came in just because, when you look at the historiography, there's mention of Irish immigrants dying, some of the nativism expressed against the Irish. And so I, did a little investigation of them. If I were to add a fourth group, I am talking, I'm going to talk broadly about the population in America. I think these are going to be focal points. So We'll talk about some of the people that weren't meant to die.
Mhm.
People like Peter Hoffman Cruz. And so I will talk about them as well. I don't know. What do you think? You think I want to. A lot of my evidence comes from letters written by women to each other. You see kind of a gender dimension of this too, in which women are, kind of questioning kind of the vulnerability narrative, and kind of warning their sons, not to travel, or kind of criticizing men for being risky, or things, or even adopting kind of you see particularly white women who own slaves, speaking about African Americans being particularly vulnerable because they needed the paternalistic care of their white masters, and who would dose them with mercury-laden medicine and police their bodies. There's, gender will play a role in this as well. So race, class, gender, yeah, I'm covering. But if you have any ideas, of groups in geographic areas, the geographic areas I find kind of interesting are, I wanted to go outside of New York City. I didn't want to focus on that. That's been written about a lot. Look at places like Utica, New York. Look at places like the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, like places like Harper's Ferry, Virginia at the time. There's the Irish camp there that suffered a lot. Look at places like Natchez, Mississippi, and look at a place, Rock Row, Arkansas, which was the location in which the Choctaws were collected.
That's fabulous. Thank you. That's all the time we have tonight. And I want to thank Paul again for sharing his research, especially taking a break from his sabbatical to join us. And I do hope that when this next book comes out, we can actually host you on campus and have this experience in person. I'd like to invite everyone back next Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, when my colleague, Dr. Kuba Kabala, will welcome Dr. Kyle Harper, who is the provost of OU and a historian of the ancient world. And he's going to be talking about his new book project on the history of infectious disease. Thank you again for joining us. Good night, be well, and wash your hands.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.